Well, then Paul reminds them that he came to them following outrageous treatment in Philippi. What had happened to them in Philippi? Got run out of town, didn't they? Yep. Who ran them out? Jews. He'd preached for 3 weeks in a synagogue, and a bunch of Jews converted to Christ, and some prominent women, and some God-fearers, and the Jews didn't like that. So remember, we talked about this last week. They went to the marketplace, and they got some vile, despicable, low-life, no-good people that they could manipulate, and they started a riot. And they went to, his name escapes me, it was the household he stayed in. Jason. They stayed in Jason's household, and they went to pull Paul out of Jason's house, and Paul wasn't there, so they pulled Jason out. And they took him to court, and he had to post bond. So that's what happened. And then the Christians there in Thessalonica said, Paul, you got to get out of here, and Paul left. Where did he go, by the way? Berea. Very good. Yep. So he says here that even though they had come from that experience, when they arrived in Thessalonica, they presented the gospel, even though they were facing similar opposition. That's what he says. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. People maybe wanted to portray Paul as being in error, he says. They were opposing Paul. They opposed him because they didn't think that Paul was sincere, and yet Paul was presenting the truth. They wanted to portray Paul as being in error or trying to trick people for profit. But Paul says instead they were preaching the truth. And Paul makes clear here that he doesn't preach to trick or deceive or to make a living. He preaches because God has called him out to preach. How many of you know who Charles Spurgeon was? Okay, Charles Spurgeon was a world-famous Baptist. He was the Billy Graham before there was Billy Graham. Okay, he was the Billy Graham of the 1800s, and he had a school preparing preachers, and he has a little book. It's available. It's called Lectures. I think it's called Lectures to My Students, and it's his lectures to those guys that he was preparing for ministry. And one of the first things he would say to each class of guys who came to prepare for ministry, he said to them, if you can be happy doing anything other than preaching, do it. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. If you are not convinced that you have been called to preach the gospel, go make a career doing something else. Doesn't mean you can't live as a Christian. Doesn't mean you can't have a powerful witness. Doesn't mean you can't have a ministry. Of course you can. But if you haven't been called to preach, don't preach. So he says here that he is preaching even in the face of this opposition because he has been called to preach by God. And Paul says that he lives his life and he conducts his ministry to an audience of one. He says, we're not trying to please people. There's only one whose approval I care about. Who's that? God. That's right. Yep. So he says that he doesn't use flattery, which means to fawn on people with his words. Paul doesn't try to make people feel good about themselves in order to manipulate them. He says he doesn't try to appear to be something he's not in order to make money or get recognition.